Hey everybody, how's it going? It's going to be something a little different. This is a storytelling video. It's not really an interview. We had a gentleman named Bill Deaver who had donated some model railroad stuff to the Tehachapi Depot Museum, and he came in to talk a little bit about the model railroading and HOs, the stuff he had, and he also told quite a few stories about his memories of riding on trains and seeing them. And I think it's important that these histories from these people be preserved. So I'm happy to do that. I was asked to video this for the museum, and I thought that it would also make something interesting for the channel. So I hope you enjoy it. He does have some very cool stories. And so let's go listen to Bill Deaver talk about his life around the railroad.
My name is Bill Deaver. I've lived in eastern Kern County since 1948, off and on, and I've been a railroad fan. I'm 86 years old. I was born in 1935. My grandfather, maternal grandfather, was the rip track foreman for the Santa Fe in Bakersfield. That's the repair and place track. So I got my first train of marks, like a lot of people did, and which is probably worth more than my car now, but anyway, or not. No. Anyway, I've loved trains all my life, and I've been an N-scale and HO scale modeler, and a lot of the trains I liked, in those days there weren't any commercial ones available, so I kit bashed them. Now this is a model of the Daylight, the Southern Pacific Daylight, which is a streamliner that started out about 1938. They had one that ran from LA to San Francisco up the coast. That was the Coast Daylight. And this is kind of like the consist of this, because they have a combine for baggage and passengers. And then there was the San Joaquin Daylight, which ran up the San Joaquin Valley and over to Tehachapi. And they had a big converted, well, they kit bashed a baggage car to make it look like it was streamlined color. And it was a wonderful train. I never rode the Coast Daylight, but I used to ride especially when I was a teenager, we moved to Mojave. And I would ride over to Bakersfield on one train on the Daylight and come back on the Santa Fe's Grand Canyon train. But anyway, the locomotives on these trains, this is a Southern Pacific GS4 Daylight locomotive. You see the Freedom train? That's the same locomotive painted red, white, and blue, back when they were doing the Freedom Train thing. These were probably some of the most beautiful steam locomotives, stream style, instead of fully streamlined, in the world. They were Northerns, 484s. And when the train came up, 51, from LA to Mojave, there were either two of those on the head end, or there were two MT5 or 6 mountain type locomotives, 482s, which did not have the side panels, but they had they were all painted up in daylight colors. And the first locomotive would stay in Bakersfield, and then when 52, the southbound or eastbound train came into Mojave, they'd run that from Bakersfield to Mojave. When they got to Mojave from Los Angeles, they had to stop and put water in these big tenders. So they had two water spouts, perfectly spouted, located. And when that train rolled into Mojave, the fireman was already up here on both the engines. And they would swing the water spout and they did this all in about 5 minutes. And then they would start those locomotives up, and I'd get choked up and still get choked up about this, for something that was one of the most exciting things I ever saw in my life. That train, which could get up to 18 or 19 cars, all lightweight, streamlined, except the baggage cars and sometimes the diners, would start from a dead stop. And you know where the Overpass is in the north end of Mojave? Well, back in the days before the Overpass, there was a crossing there. In fact, anyway, by the time that thing hit that crossing, and you know about how far it is from where the depot was, and it'd be going about 40 miles an hour. And you got these two steam locomotives, just because it's a hill. They're going up a hill there. just giving it everything they had. And then they go up a little hill, and then they go down, and then they go up again. But I'm telling you, the earth actually moved. You could feel the ground shaking. And it was just an exciting thing to see. Anyway, when the Southern Pacific built these trains, this was the 30s, the streamline era in the world, when the world went from old boxy, horseless carriages and that sort of thing to streamlined equipment, cars, airplanes, everything. And the Southern Pacific was a big steam locomotive railroad. The Santa Fe, and I don't think I have, I guess I've got the Santa Fe stuff over here. The Santa Fe was the first railroad that used stainless steel lightweight cars. And they ran a train from Bakersfield to Oakland, the Golden Gate. And that was all, and that thing, years ago, I don't know whether it's still around or not anymore. Railroad Magazine, Trains is still around, but this every year they have a speed chart listing the fastest trains in America. And between Bakersfield and Hanford, and I rode that a lot because my family lived in Riverdale, and we would ride the train from Bakersfield to Hanford, and then my dad would pick us up and take us to Riverdale, which is out in the boondocks northwest, near Bakersfield, anyway, those trains would get up to 100 miles an hour. And it was kind of funny because the big objections to high-speed rail in the San Joaquin Valley, a lot of it's come from Hanford. And it's ironic as hell because Hanford had one of the first high-speed rail trains in the world. And I don't think anybody in Hanford realizes that. But that train, in fact, I used to get very upset about that because I was a kid and I'd just get on the train and I'd just get comfortable and I'd have to get off. Because it would start out in Bakersfield the same way going the other way. But it was all, silver colored and had the Santa Fe streamlined F7 diesel locomotives on the front. And they usually had 2 or 3 on the front. They started out, when they first started, they had the old early General Motors E1 locomotives, which was the shovel nose. It had the street, the nose was really sharp that. Yeah. Those, and they'd have an A and a B unit, and they'd have that train with another combine car and a diner, usually a kind of a, I can't remember what they call it. It was kind of like going into a soda fountain. They'd have a bunch of, or a bar. Oh. And you sit down and you could get a snack or something, take it back to your seat or something.
Well, you're on Santa Fe now.
Yeah, I was on Santa Fe.
Finish this one up.
Yeah, well, anyway, so the Southern Pacific and the Union Pacific, for reasons known only to them, and I think both of them were owned by the Harriman family at that time. You remember Mr. Averill Harriman, who was the Secretary of State years ago? His family owned those railroads, and they had another Middle West Railroad, which I can't remember. But they were real big on articulated cars. So let's move this out here, and let's move this over here. This was their triple unit diner coffee shop. This center car was a kitchen. And one car, I can't remember which was which, was a diner. Oh, the diner was back here with all the first class. It was with the observation car and everything else. And then the coffee shop was up with all the coaches. And, where the poor folks like us rode. And which wasn't a big, it was about a $5 trip in those days. But, so, see, they've got a truck here, and they've got these trucks in the middle. And they held up the, and you'd walk through there, and you didn't even realize what you were doing unless you were a rail buff. And they had the same thing on this other train over here, the Lark, which was the West Coast version of the 20th Century Limited. Remember the big all overnight streamlined all Pullman train between Chicago and New York? Well, the Lark ran from LA to San Francisco up the coast, and it was all painted two-tone gray, reverse two-tone gray from the East Coast trains. But that was, for most of its life, it was all Pullman, and it had a triple unit diner, and they've got a model of that over there. But they had and this is an overnight train, so they didn't serve anything. You could go up to the diner and get a snack in the middle of the night, but when you got on the train, in either end, you could go up and have a little snack before you went to bed. So they had a little tavern car snack was one of these, and then the next car was a diner or a kitchen. I mean, it's a diner. So if you wanted to sit down, and then the last car was a combination. It was the combination with the tavern car, and the kitchen was in one. They didn't need a real big kitchen on that train. And then the Union Pacific had a lot of articulated Pullman cars that ran over Donner Pass. And it was just a way of, you didn't have as many wheels to work on or anything like that. And they had all the daylight coaches on the daylight were all articulated coaches. There'd be two car bodies on each end, and the men's restroom would be in one end of it, and the women's restroom would be in the other end of it. So if you were in the wrong end, you had to get a little exercise going to the bathroom, and or you had to run faster as you go to the bathroom. But it was all, everything was kept clean and neat. The trip from Mojave to Bakersfield on either that train, now from Mojave to Bakersfield, all Santa Fe had was a train called the Grand Canyon, and it was the North Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon ran from Chicago to Los Angeles, and it was a mixed coach and Pullman train. And it stopped every other town and moved cars in and out, going to Texas and everything like that. But we got the northern end of that, which ran from Barstow up to Oakland. And I say Oakland because going up to San Joaquin Valley, the only way you could get to San Francisco starting out was taking a boat or a ferry. And then they eventually built a bridge, but it wasn't a railroad bridge. But it was exciting to see these trains. And of course, back in those days, there were about 4 or 5 passenger trains, maybe 6, that ran between Bakersfield and Mojave. The daylight and the Grand Canyon were the kind of first class passenger trains because they came through Mojave in the daytime. They were just beautiful trains, and the Grand Canyon was for most of the time I watched it was regular diesel locomotives. But the trip from Mojave to Bakersfield was about 2 hours. Now for a freight train, and a couple of times, my wife and I used to own the Mojave Desert News, and I would use that excuse, I want to write a story about people running in front of trains, and maybe we can discourage it. But what I really wanted was a cab ride. And I got a lot of cab rides, and I got to ride the roofs one time. So a freight train usually took about 4 hours to get from Mojave to Bakersfield and back. So that's now on the other end of this train, and now that between this diner and this combine would be 2 or 3 of those articulated coaches. And then there would be some articulated coaches back here. And then right in front of the observation car would be a tavern car. And the bar was here in the middle where there's no windows. And the thing was a full-fledged tavern car. You could go back there. And I remember during the war, we lived in Madera, but we couldn't get off the train on the Santa Fe in Madera because the depot was a little shack out about 4 miles west of town. So we'd ride to Fresno. Anyway, one time during the war, I'll tell you, the trains were just jammed. And the military, obviously, for obvious reasons, had priorities. But I'll never forget one time, some interesting trips up and down the San Joaquin Valley on trains. And one time, my brother Mike and my mother and I rode the whole trip from Bakersfield to Mojave in the women's restroom. because the women's restroom, the men's restroom was just like a telephone booth. You know, we don't need as much room.
Yeah.
I don't know why, but the
Can't
women,
hit it anyway.
the women had a lounge. They had a little room where they could sit there and do what they, and I know a couple of times we had to, Mike and I had to, we were about 5 or 6 years old, had to step out in the hallway so somebody, you know, could take their clothes off or whatever. But then one time we rode the whole trip in the tavern car. And the interesting thing about that, we got to Fresno, my dad gets off the train and he goes, "Oh!" And I said, "What's the matter?" He said, "That guy was sitting next to you?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, he was, you know, one of these people, I can't remember the politically correct term for it, but he had mental problems. And he was drunk. And he talked to Dad for about 2 hours all of that trip. And my dad said, "I gotta get a drink." Okay, now the Santa Fe ran a lot of power after they, you know, got through using the early diesels, which, by the way, had 2 diesel power motors in it. And what those diesels run electric traction motors on the axles.
Yeah.
So it'd be real easy to change it over to all electric. You just take those diesel units out and figure out a way to connect it to either the third rail or overhead catenary, which is what the high-speed rail is going to have. And I've ridden, my wife and I had a great fortune when we lived in DC. For about 12 years, we went to Europe a couple of times. We had some people, friends of ours from Mojave, who were living in Germany. And we'd go over for 2 weeks. In the middle week, we would go to their house and we could wash our clothes. And the second trip we made was right after the wall came down. So we went over into East Germany. And it was like going into the United States in the 1930s.
Wow.
The whole country was just, after World War II, the free world blossomed.
They didn't.
The Russians, it was just the same, they didn't change anything at all. That's what's wonderful about it.
Yeah.
And now Putin wants to make the rest of the world that way. Have any of you ever ridden on this is a full dome car. You ever ridden on dome cars?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, okay, that's the best. But Santa Fe had, these are all coach cars. And we rode one of those, the San Francisco Chief. That was the last great new train in the United States. And I think the Denver Zephyr came out about the same time. Those are the last 2, but that ran from San Francisco to Chicago, and then we had all kinds of trains coming in as they went out there. But we rode it, well, I'd ride it to Bakersfield once in a while, which didn't make a lot of sense, but it was like, got to ride the train. But my wife and I had some friends in Flagstaff. So we took the train. The only problem is it came through Mojave at night. So we rode this and we sat in the dome car the whole time. It was really nice. You know, it was a nice moonlit night and very, very nice. But all those San Francisco Zephyrs had one of these. It had a couple of coaches, and the rest of it was sleeping cars and a diner. And but most of these cars are not very exciting. Most of them are models of, this is a smooth side. The Santa Fe has some smooth side sleepers. This is a 442, and that's the 4 sections, 4, you know, different types. Any of you ever ridden on a Pullman? Huh? Oh, I thought you were waving your hand and playing with your camera. Anyway, it's an interesting experience. It was like sleeping in a bedroom about this big, but it was fun. But and these trains, the rest of the cars were all. The Santa Fe was really big on corrugated sides, and this is a diner.
Was there a reason for that, Bill?
Huh?
Was there a reason for the?
Corrugation?
Yeah.
I think they did it just for looks.
Okay.
But
It also makes it a lot stronger.
Oh, yeah, that's right. It
And
wouldn't
it won't.
Anyway, these are almost all of them are models of sleeping cars. Oh, and this last car, I don't know where the truck is just sitting here. This is, I don't know whether you've ever seen this car, it still comes through here every once in a while. That's a theater car. And it's on the back end of a business train, and if you get up here close to it.
Turn
you
the
can-
back of it.
Huh? Well, they're both sides are the same, aren't they?
Yeah. Show the end where the.
Oh, yeah, see that end?
Yeah.
Okay, I got to ride those things a couple of times. I rode one of them from Mojave to Bakersfield when they were, remember a few years ago, the Santa Fe paid to widen, add an extra track over the hill? Well, right before they did that, they took a bunch of us community leaders and over the hill, and then we were all sitting back at the back here, and they had a dome car right in front of that. And so this, you see how those windows slope down?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the seats slope down, that's why they call it a theater car. And you have a great view out of there. And then the rest of it, there was a bar down in here, and then everybody else there was a bar up here. So I don't think people were understanding the words by the time we got to Bakersfield because they were too drunk.
Yeah.
I rode one. My wife and I both worked for congressmen, and when we were in D.C., I ran a congressman's office, and she was business manager for a couple of congressmen. But the railroads are always trying to keep us people working in Congress happy. So the CSX, the East Coast Railroad, well, they had one of those, and they took us down to Williamsburg, and we spent the day. We got a free chicken dinner, and then we got in the train and went back. And so Billy and I wandered back to the theater car. They didn't have a dome car, but it was a nice perk. It didn't cost us anything. Let's see, I got the Lark over here. Now, the Lark was all Pullmans, and there was nothing exciting on that train except it had, I told you, the triple unit diner tavern car. But it was a really nice train. The problem, if you ever noticed that the Southern Pacific had lights all over at each end of the train, they had all these lights, especially on the rear end. Well, the reason for that is the Southern Pacific for a long time kept running into the rear end of its passenger train. And the Lark one time they had a GS4 rear-ended a Lark somewhere over on the coast and killed several people, including an Army officer who was sleeping in his. It was just, so that's why the Southern Pacific has got all these little red lights and everything. And you notice it more on the business cars. Of course, since the UP took over, a lot of things changed. The Southern Pacific had one of the most beautiful business cars. You know what I'm talking about. It's like the open platform and everything. They had a president back in the 60s named Donald Russell, who was a legend in his own time. I guess he was one of the meanest and nastiest people in the railroad industry. Railroads, did any of you ever work for railroads?
No.
Because of safety, railroads are run like the Army or the military. It's because you make one little mistake and you got a whole bunch of cars in somebody's backyard or something like that. And Russell was anyway, he decided when he got the job that he wanted a new business car because they had these old converted, two-tone gray cars that used to come through Mojave on the daylight. They put them on the back end of the daylight. And anyway, and they'd also put them in the back end of the Lark. And the back end of the Lark had a regular round observation thing. Well, they kept putting so many business cars in the back of that train that they squared off the back of that car. And they had 2 or 3 of those cars, and some of them are still running because some railroad, someplace bought one of those cars and turned it into a business car for their officials. But a business car it's got a little lounge area in the back, and then there's 2 or 3 bedrooms in it, one big fancy one for the whoever the highest ranking officer is, and a little crappy office bedroom for his secretary, who was always a man. And then they had a little dining room, and then they had a little kitchen, and that was a business car. So anyway, and I got to ride on them a couple of times. one of the great things about having jobs like I've had, I was always able to come my way into writing things like that nobody else got to. I got to ride at one of the trains that go up to Trona.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I told him, I called up the railroad and said, I run the Mojave Desert News, I'd like to do a story on that. And I always use the thing that I'm trying to get people to stop at railroad crossings. And I would write my story about that, you know, because I've seen some horrible accidents. But we rode the train from Mojave up to Cyril Station. And that Cyril Station is where they have their own railroad up there. And, or they did, I don't know whether UP does it or not, but they take a lot of cars from Cyril's up into Trona. And that's a major operation up there. So, anything else? Oh, some other stories. There was, years ago, I worked at the post office in Mojave when I got out of high school for a year. And the postmaster was a guy named Barney Finn. And his son went to school with me and was a school teacher and retired. I don't know whether he's still alive or not. But Barney, in his younger days, was a railway mail clerk. And the Southern Pacific ran a passenger train from LA to Bishop, or Lone Pine,
Yeah.
every day for many years. And Barney was a railway mail clerk, and he said, once you got past Mojave was always a big mail switching place. I worked at the post office in Mojave for a while, and, well, I just said that, but anyway, we would get mail from all over, and once every 2 weeks, the Navy would get the payroll for China Lake at the post office. They would come in on the daylight, and there'd be guys with guns, with machine guns, and they'd be all around the depot when they unloaded all that big payroll, you know. And then they'd bring it over to the post office, and Barney and I would do all the little paperwork it had to be, and there's all these guys standing out in the street with 4 guys on each, one guy on each corner with a machine gun in his arms.
I got a completely different question. You say regarding passenger service, you talk about Pullman service or a Pullman train.
Well, Pullman's sleepers.
And is that the style of, I mean, I heard.
No, Pullman was a business. And in fact, up until, I think maybe the 50s or 60s, Pullman owned every sleeping car in the United States, with 1 or 2 exceptions. And there would be a Pullman conductor on a train, and if the train had coaches, then there'd be a railroad conductor who took care of his cars. And you know, trains like the Lark, it was all Pullman. In fact, the observation car on the Lark had a bar, and that bartender worked for Pullman Company, and they just had nobody else could do it. Then finally, the government said, "No, you got to let the railroads do this." And but they ran a first-class service. Everything was nice and clean, fresh sheets and everything like that.
So you buy a ticket on that train for $10. The railroad got $2 and Pullman got $8.
Yeah, something like that, right?
Oh, okay. So.
And lots of times you would see on a train, if you were a rail buff and looking for all kinds of details, the car would look like, now these cars, this is a classic example, this is a Pullman sleeping car. It says Southern Pacific here, and then it's got the Southern Pacific had these little logos on the side. They're the only railroad that did that, and had the Lark, the Daylight, and everybody had these little Daylight. In fact, on the passenger, like the Southern Pacific, the Daylight, they would have a little, because of the corrugation, they'd have a little flat piece of metal there that was painted red, and the little logo was on that. But then, at the ends of each car, in little type, it said Pullman. And that's the way you knew that the Pullman company owned and operated that train, or that car. The tail cars on the 20th Century Limited and the Lark, and any first class overnight Pullman train, that they had those trains, the observation car had master bedrooms. And those are about the nicest place to sleep. It was like having a little apartment. And the passenger locomotives and the or the freight locomotives had different gearing
Yeah.
for higher speeds and stuff like that. But they usually had a steam generator back here and some of these little things back here.
Yeah.
And it was like a big, if you ever been
Hot
inside?
water heater.
Yeah, it was a big hot water heater. It was about this big around and about the height of the locomotive.
Now, where did they store the water?
In a tank.
In a tank
Where
somewhere?
they had a tank under, one of these tanks under here, and a engine like that was for water.
That'd be pretty good size.
Yeah, and of course they had to refill. I don't know whether they refill those things. I know where they used to That's a good thing that you brought that up, because I always got a kick out of it when we went to Fresno to get on the train, like the daylight. There would be people. Fresno was kind of in the middle, so there'd be guys with hoses that are taking the poop out of the toilets, and you'd have another hose over here which is getting ready to put the water back in so they could get the poop to come out this way. So, but they would pump the water into the tanks, there down at the bottom of them. And the big advantage of trains is you can stop at some of these intermediate places. But you can't do that with an airplane, and the alternative to that is riding a bus or driving. And the great thing about trains is you can get up and walk around. You can go up to the dining car or the snack car or whatever. Everybody complains about, the food on trains. Well, the food on trains is always terrible. In the old days, they had a nice white, linen thing, and food wasn't that much better as it is now. But anyway, it was just, and you could look out the window and see where you were going. That's why when we went to Europe, both times we went to Europe, we didn't rent a car, we rode trains. In fact, we got Eurail passes. And that's a great thing, because you just, once in a while you'd have to pay a little bit more if you're going to Switzerland or someplace like that. But I'll tell you, if you're looking for something that's interesting to do, some summer, or probably about, I'd say, October, because the kids are back in school, go to Europe for a couple of weeks and ride the trains. Ride them all over, and that's the best way to, and the other great thing about it is you meet the local people. Yeah. And I can see stuff online now. God, there's trains all over the world that are fixing up. God, you can rent half of them tomorrow. And really fancy stuff. Trains are still around. Yeah. And it's interesting. You see where people are building trains in countries that don't even have highways, and they're kind of bypassing the highway thing and putting in nice train systems. But the Lark was just a first class. First class train, and the consist of it and this 20th Century Limited, even though there were different railroads, it was essentially the same.
So basically the consist was sort of dictated by Pullman, I guess.
Well, it was dictated by these trains. These were trains, back in those days, a lot of people don't realize that a lot of the people that rode the trains in those days were business people.
Sure.
They didn't get in their car and go to San Francisco. They got on a train and went to San Francisco on business. And a lot of it was overnight. So they would, you get on a train like that, and you notice that most of the people on that train at night during the week were business people going from point A to point B. And it was just, it was several different, from a roomette or a section was the cheapest. That was where you just kind of folded your seat, over, and that was the simplest and cheapest way to ride on a train, was something called a section. And you'd have one person sleeping down here and one person sleeping up above them, and there'd be a kind of a curtain in front of it.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed that. I hope you can see what I was talking about, how the history that people have in their memories needs to be shared with everyone so we don't lose it. There are so many things that I wish I had asked my grandfather about the history of the oil field, which he spent most of his career doing, and other history. Granddad was a big history buff, Western history, all kinds of stuff. And I wish I would have done an interview or something, kind of like something that we did here. Just sit there and listen to him talk like we did here. If you have any elderly folks in your family, or even folks my age. I'm 62, but I have a lot of memories and a lot of cool stories. If you have somebody like that in your family, maybe you ought to sit down with them and do something like this, so those memories can be shared and passed down to the future generations, so we don't forget that it wasn't always about flat screens, video games, and the internet. All right, keep shooting me the ideas. Drop me comments below. Shoot me an email at motorpullet59@gmail.com. Like, share, subscribe, click on the bell if you want to be notified of future content, and we'll see you all later.